Good morning, good afternoon, leftists, liberals, radicals, sports fans, sports nuts, and everybody else in between, and welcome to another edition of Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, Left Sports Radio, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections overlapping the world of sports, activism, and radical politics. We are available for broadcast by Pacific Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are using us. If you can't listen live, we are available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of our podcast and video editions are also available at notanothersportshow.podbean.com and at tinyurl.com/NASRadioVideo, thanks to our friends at Urbana Public Television. To contact the show, you can use the @NAS Radio Sports handle on Twitter and Instagram, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, or the hashtag NASRadio to let us know your thoughts, your point of views, and your perspectives for all the topics that we are covering on this week's show. And if there's something you'd like to see us cover on a future edition of the show, be sure to definitely let us know. Well, we have got a few major political athletes to talk about this week, with the stories largely revolving this week in the world of sports and politics news around two individuals, one in the NFL, the other in the NBA. And so we are going to focus most of our show talking about these two individuals, as well as a bit of the roundup of other sports news, including some big news coming out of the NBA on a number of social issues, and we'll be closing up talking with some international soccer news and some hockey news to round out this week's broadcast. So we are going to get right into it, and we are going to be talking a bit of NFL news this week in the Colin Kaepernick Watch. In Colin Kaepernick news, the group 100 Suits for 100 Men, the nonprofit that received a number of suits from Colin Kaepernick recently to give to recent parolees to try to help them get employment, was set to and did an act of support and solidarity for the free agent by holding a demonstration out in front of the NFL's corporate headquarters in New York. About 70 individuals were present in New York City outside the NFL headquarters, showing support and solidarity for the free agent quarterback Colin Kaepernick, the 29-year-old quarterback. Threw 16 touchdowns and 4 interceptions last season on the San Francisco 49ers, yet still can't find a job when many other quarterbacks in the league are getting signed to new deals and continuing to be brought in and put on teams as backups, even though their statistics, their performance has been much worse, much harsher, and really showing that there's a bit of a case to be made that this could be about the politics behind Kaepernick's decision to do what he did last season when he engaged in the symbolic protest. That largely what we could be seeing is a pushback against that, a blackballing, if you will, by the NFL. There was also demonstrations in other parts of New York, Las Vegas, Orlando, Chicago, Houston, Washington, D.C., Miami, Detroit, Columbus, Charleston, Lewiston, Maine, and Providence, Rhode Island. So a lot of different cities seeing actions in support of Colin Kaepernick and what he has been advocating for, which is accountability for police officers, pushing back against racial injustice, and pushing back against state violence that is codified in this racial violence as well. And to see the support that Colin Kaepernick's getting is very much heartening from the groups that he's helping out, the Know Your Rights workshops, the different charities and organizations that he is providing funding to every month by putting $1 million out to fund a number of different groups who are battling racist oppression, sexist oppression, climate issues, that he is funding a number of different organizations that are pushing the good fight on a number of different issues. And it was always really weird to me, and it continues to be really weird to me, that people are overjoyed that Colin Kaepernick is somehow unemployed. Recently, a former grade school and high school friend that I went to school with had posted a picture of Colin Kaepernick, and it said, "Colin Kaepernick is still employed. Share this if it makes you smile." And that's really disheartening that Colin Kaepernick, you may not liked his protest, you may not have liked his action, but these are also the same people, largely in the conservative reactionary sphere, who are also very big supporters of the Constitution and that they love the Constitution. Most notably, they love the Second Amendment of the Constitution, almost a bit more so than some of the other amendments. Apparently, they like the second more than the first, because they're happy that Colin Kaepernick, a guy who engaged in free speech issues, is facing pushback from government officials as well, with a number of government officials coming out and saying things, even to the point that a number of NFL front offices are supposedly afraid to bring in Colin Kaepernick because they fear a series of mean tweets from President Donald J. Trump. And that's some of the real issue here, that instead of being angry about Colin Kaepernick saying something and giving all the backlash to Colin Kaepernick having taken an action against a issue like racist oppression, the lack of police accountability, the complete police impunity in killings, the racial discrimination that happens with those, that instead of putting your anger and your animus there, you're putting your anger and animus and your hatred and your dislike towards the person who seems to be pointing out the problem. And it's very weird to me to see a lot of very small government conservatives, a lot of small government libertarian types who are very supportive of the fraternal orders of police, that traditionally they have been opposed to the use of state action and state violence. And it's very interesting also to see how most people on the liberal left, and I do mean liberals on the liberal left, and that's very narrow spectrum, as well as the right, all seem to be okay with the use of state violence against their political opponents, rather than simply stating that state violence is inappropriate and wrong. That state violence is the problem, whether it's through capital punishment, through policing structures, that state violence is the problem that we need to address. And not allow it to happen, or just say, oh, well, that's okay because it's happening to somebody I don't like. That largely what we saw when the Obama administration was in power was a lot of the policing structures, a lot of the deportation structures. There was criticism of those structures in place, saying, these are really terrible structures. These are really terrible things that are being put up. The drone system, for instance, too. And a lot of liberals, a lot of Democratic Party supporters were okay with this idea because they trusted the guy in power with it, and really refused to listen to any kind of argument that said, you know, one day a guy you don't trust is going to have this power. Is this really still something you think that the government should be having? Well, now we have a guy in power with that, and the Republicans are all very much in favor of him having this authority and him having this power, and we need to do things to support our nation's law enforcement, as the White House page put up, which is really turning a lot of conservative ideology on its head. And having two parents who voted Republican for a number of years, they're still the small government conservatives, that they're still concerned about the issues of state authority and the authority that government's being given in impacting people's lives, especially through the use of state violence. And the lack of consistency we're seeing is a disturbing thing, and the fact that we focus so much animus, so much hate, so much dislike on Colin Kaepernick, and we have people on the right cheering that he's still a free agent and hasn't been put on a team just yet. And we have people on the liberal left saying that he went too far and disrespected the police. Completely miss the heart of this argument of why he was doing what he was doing. And it's become more about the cult of personality, more about, you know, the symbolism of what he did, rather than the functions of what he did and what he started to expose. Now, Titans wide receiver Rishard Matthews initially was very critical of Colin Kaepernick. He's the Titans' top wideout last season, and had a father who's in the military. He had a brother die during military service working for a private contracting firm. was initially very critical of Colin Kaepernick's protest. And in the aftermath of the protest and seeing all the stuff that's happened in the country since then, has had a bit of a change of heart. And during an interview with the Tennessean this week, said, quote, "Being somebody who's had a family member pass away in the military, I think a lot of people, even myself, looked at it the wrong way. But if you take a deeper perspective on it and understand what he's doing, I think that he's doing a great thing, and I think that he's definitely not on a team because of that," close quote. And that's largely it, that the Pledge of Allegiance ideas of standing up for the pledge, standing up for the national anthem, and this kind of push that real patriots stand up for the pledge, real patriots stand up for the national anthem, and if you don't like it, get out of the country. That a lot of things happened with American freedom. A lot of soldiers died for a lot of reasons. And one of those reasons was not to have to stand up for a compulsory pledge or a compulsory anthem. And the fact that we want Kaepernick to do that shows a really distinct irony in how a lot of people tend to approach this situation. He also continued, Matthews saying, quote, "I think he was a great quarterback, and I mean, he went to the Super Bowl. There's other quarterbacks, not to dog any quarterbacks, but there's other lesser quarterbacks on teams right now, and the fact that he doesn't have a job is kind of messed up. I don't know the contract situation, everything involved with it, but I think overall, the number one reason is obviously what he did," close quote. And that goes back to some NFL people in the front office saying that they hadn't seen somebody as hated as Colin Kaepernick as they did when Ray Caruth played in the league. And Ray Caruth was a former member of the Carolina Panthers. He was a receiver for the Carolina Panthers who is doing a prison sentence for murdering his girlfriend because she was pregnant and he didn't want to pay child support, so he put out a hit on her, had her killed. The child was ultimately born and is still living today, but he's in prison for that. Somehow, standing up against police abuses, the police impunity when they utilize state violence, the lack of accountability, somehow, in the minds of NFL executives, is almost somehow similar to that. But big props to Rashard Matthews for saying that, he's acknowledged, yeah, I looked at this the wrong way, and I think it's a great thing that Colin Kaepernick's doing. And the symbolism of the protest is important. That symbolic protest symbolism is important, but we also need to move to the on-the-ground organizing. He's helping to fund that on-the-ground organizing and doing the stuff to push on-the-ground organizing as well as some of the symbolism. And so it's really heartening to continue to see that happening. And hopefully Colin Kaepernick is able to get a job in the NFL. The Seattle Seahawks, as of this broadcast, brought him in and have been interested in bringing him in as a backup quarterback potentially. So hopefully we can see some movement there and have Colin Kaepernick get added to a team, because he is far too talented to be sitting out and not really doing much of anything. That was one of our major key athletes that we are going to be talking about this week on the broadcast. The other major key athlete that we're going to focus on is in the NBA, and we are going to talk about a member of the Zombie Sonics. Yes, the Oklahoma City Thunder, the team I tend to call the Zombie Sonics after they said that they were going to stay in Seattle, and then ultimately Clay Bennett moved the team to get a lot of money for himself and to get what the previous Commissioner Stern wanted, the red state appeal of the NBA. So they moved the team to Oklahoma City. So you may hear me interspersively calling them the Zombie Sonics in this upcoming story. But we're going to get into it talking a bit of international politics and international intrigue in other sports news. In NBA news this week, Enes Kanter, the 6-year NBA star and 6-year pro for the Oklahoma City Thunder, had his Turkish passport pulled while in Romania by the government. He has been a frequent critic of the current government of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and has been very outspoken about it, even recently saying that he's the Hitler of this century, which is a bit far, to necessarily say, Godwin's law, the first person to invoke the Nazis necessarily loses. But really pushing back against the human rights abuses, really pushing back against the authoritarian structures that President Erdogan has put in place. They not only pulled his passport to try to make his international travel difficult, they've also issued an arrest warrant for him this week and have accused him of being part of a, quote, armed terrorist organization, close quote, for being a supporter of the movement of exile Fethullah Gulen. And they also want an Interpol red notice to have Enes Kanter deported back to Turkey. And we've highlighted a little bit of athletes getting political, athletes talking about politics in their own countries, and the human rights issues of Recep Tayyip Erdogan are certainly not to be, overlooked or underwhelmed. They're certainly not to be ignored. And Kanter's publicly laughed this off on social media that, yeah, there's no way they're getting me. Ha. Yeah. And to call him part of an armed terrorist organization is really just, again, part of this kind of authoritarian structure, this push by President Erdogan to really use force against anything that disagrees with him so he can kind of mobilize and centralize control. And in January of this year, the anarchist newspaper Meydan had their editor sentenced to a year and 3 months in prison for, quote-unquote, supporting terror, close quote, because they had articles that criticized President Erdogan and supported the Kurdish group, the YPG, that's been fighting ISIS. Well, in January of this year, the newspaper Meydan published an article right before they were banned in Turkey, pushing back, and thanks to freedomnews.org.uk for translating this article and publicizing it for us, talking on the ground why people are pushing back against the Turkish government and President Erdogan. Quote, with the fear and shock that constantly oppresses our lives, with the agendas that change by the day, by the hour, with the constant repetition we see in news articles, debates, newspapers, and radios, with the shares and retweets, the media that takes us for idiots and is fed by manipulation, with the gentrification and demolition policies that erased our past, our identity and our memory, with the illusion of democracy that weakens and imprisons our freedom, and with the reality that becomes more and more incomprehensible every day, we are being cornered. We are being cornered because the rulers require it in order to declare their authority and assert their dominance over our stolen willpower. We are being cornered because the rulers require it to keep their power and create new objects to use in their own wars. We are being cornered because this is the only way the government is able to create space for itself and exist. We are being cornered by misery. The days that have to keep going through the exhaustion, the bodies that fall powerless, the minds that become unhappy as they weaken. The rulers submerge the streets that we used to walk to school in the mornings, to go to work, and to catch a bus in darkness. They corner us with unhappiness by squeezing us into minibuses and metro buses that are full to the brim and sending us to work at the crack of dawn. As the government corners us with unhappiness, they drag us towards hopelessness and despair. We must resist the government that decides when we may sleep and when we must wake, that snatches our morning sun and pushes us towards darkness and despair in order to win back our minds and bodies. We must find the courage to defy those who would turn us into blind and deaf, unknowing and unfeeling individuals, and break out of this complacency and corneredness. The broadcasting prohibitions that follow exploding bombs, the unfounded accusations after suspicious packages are found and bomb threats are made, the people who choose or are forced to choose to stay away from crowded places, the dollars that are exchanged in order to prevent a crisis, the people who dream of running away from the land that is oppressed by war, death, and economic crises. In the land we live in, the government dominates the individual with fear and panic. It incapacitates, corners, and in time, annihilates. As the government enforces this state of fear and panic in all public areas, the individual loses control, becomes vulnerable, and is cornered into the annihilation imposed by the rulers. Our lives are cornered into the grip of crises or death, and our days are spent looking for a way out of fear and panic, out of this corneredness. The only way out of this fear and paranoia that wear down our bodies and minds, and that allow the socioeconomic circumstances to slowly consume us, is through creating spaces for ourselves outside this panic culture. The way to create a world in which we won't be cornered and imprisoned by fear and panic is to expand the spaces where the rulers impose fear on us and eliminate the culture that makes paranoiacs of us all. The attempted coup by the regional state of emergency that was declared in the aftermath, and the operations that are conducted against the Kurdish government and revolutionaries almost every day with the excuse of the Fethullah terrorist organization, which Erdogan claims is linked to Fethullah Gulen and behind the abortive July coup last year. The surveillance and arrests, the people dismissed from their jobs because of the new rulings by decree that are announced every day, the judges that are put under surveillance during trials, the bills that are put forward, amended and passed as we all sleep, the bombs that explode in 2 different locations in the same week, the assassinations occurring before the effects of the bombs have passed, the images of soldiers burned alive by ISIS. In the geography we live in, we're greeted by each new day of the past 6 months with last-minute news. When one day is clouded by news of bombs, the next is greeted by Turkish military tanks entering Syria. Just as the friendship between Russia and the Republic of Turkey starts to settle, the assassination of a Russian ambassador sends us into a panic of we're going to war with Russia. We can no longer keep up with the news that drops like bombs and headlines that can change multiple times a day. Far from keeping up with the ever and increasingly swiftly changing agendas of our ruler, we're flung from one agenda to the next, and we are cornered by them. They go on to talk about the media and the cornerings of the democratic process and the very real issues that are related to some of the concerns about how free the election was that President Erdogan recently won. And it's a very powerful, full article and is really, really strong to read the entire thing. It was in issue 35 of the Maidan newspaper. And they concluded saying, quote, "Against those that incarcerate us, that break our will as they corner us, and in that time make prisoners of us, from the corneredness that we have been subjected to, we must break free. We're at the threshold of a socioeconomic explosion due to this very corneredness, and we must step over. We must mold unrestricted lives with our collective hands, that is to say, with our organizations." And in March of this year, anarchist women made another edition of the banned newspaper Maidan and continued to push that out and publicize that and continued to hand it out freely in public. And so this is the government that's being pushed back against. It's being pushed back against by anarchists. It's being pushed back by the Islamic movement, the Gulen movement, that he has a number of human rights abuses, President Erdogan does. And this kind of authoritarian pushback, this kind of authoritarianism is certainly going to continue to be seen in the politics of Turkey. It's also going to continue to be seen in the sports world as we get these kinds of intersections. And it's very interesting to see sports coverage have to begin talking about some of these issues related to the politics of Turkey and the politics of the authoritarian government of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In sports news, which you don't normally necessarily think that you're going to get much international politics in your sports news, but times and places are strange things, and that's what we've got. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, and we've just been discussing Colin Kaepernick and the solidarity rally that happened, as well as the Turkish government backlash against Enes Kanter for daring to criticize President Tayyip Erdogan. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, we'll be analyzing the fake repeal of the anti-gay, anti-trans House Bill 2 in North Carolina, and how it's even hoodwinked more supporters, not just the NCAA. And so we are back here again talking about some NBA news, and so we're going to continue that talk with some more NBA news. In NBA news, further on this week, North Carolina has announced that they will be receiving the 2019 All-Star Game for the National Basketball Association. Yes, the NBA has bought into the faux repeal of House Bill 2 and has awarded them the 2019 All-Star Game after pulling the most recent All-Star Game out of Charlotte over the anti-gay, anti-trans bathroom bill, House Bill 2, that after pulling it and seeing a faux repeal happen, the NBA, as well as the NCAA, have decided that rewarding the state is the appropriate measure here. That they bought into this faux repeal of House Bill 2. In a statement they issued, the NBA's new Commissioner Silver, said, quote, "While we understand the concerns of those who say the repeal of HB 2 did not go far enough, we believe the recent legislation eliminates the most egregious aspects of prior law. Additionally, it allows us to work with the leadership of the Hornets organization to apply a set of equality principles to ensure that every All-Star event will proceed with open access and anti-discrimination policies. All venues, hotels, and businesses we work with during the All-Star will adhere to these policies as well. Sports have a long history of helping to change attitudes around important social issues. We believe in holding our All-Star activities in Charlotte will be a powerful way for the NBA to continue this tradition," close quote. There is so much to unpack here. While you understand the concerns of people that believe the repeal did not go far enough, you're gonna go with it because you believe that, quote, "the most recent legislation eliminates the most egregious aspects of the prior law," close quote. Now, this may be an old school quote, but Malcolm X once said that you don't take a knife that's embedded in somebody's back 9 inches, pull it out 6, and claim that's progress. Why? Because the knife is still 3 inches deep in their back. That getting rid of the most egregious parts of the law, or the most terrible and horrible parts of the law, doesn't make it any better. It just makes it slightly less worse. It doesn't make it better that there's still really terrible parts of the legislation. It doesn't make it okay that they got rid of some of the most egregious parts of the legislation. It's still a terrible bill, not worth rewarding. It's still a horrible bill, not worth rewarding. And if you look at the pushback that they've continued to try to have in that state with some of the other legislation that's been put on there, that we have got some very real concerns about the state of North Carolina. This week as we go to air, the U.S. Supreme Court actually threw out a lot of their election maps over targeted racism in how they were gerrymandering the districts in that state to keep a Republican supermajority. And preventing people from being protected for 3 years, which is what this repeal does. It prevents any city from passing anti-discrimination statutes for 3 years. And it allows the state to keep the sole ability to mandate legislation on bathroom use. You know, small government conservatives all of a sudden caring about which bathroom a person uses. I mean, it's also deeply ironic that there's been more Republican legislators getting arrested for inappropriate bathroom conduct than there have any trans person in the history of ever getting arrested for it. But somehow putting that in place, not allowing for a city to have its own protections if the city decides that it wants to have those protections be put in place, is enough of a change to reward the state of North Carolina here. Or the limits on bathroom policy still being given to the state for the state to decide. And when the state gets to decide who can do basic things like use a public restroom, they are not just talking about restrooms. It's not just talking about restroom policy here, that this is a larger structure. It's the same way as saying Jim Crow wasn't necessarily just about water fountains. It was about existing in public space, being treated as an equal in public space, being allowed to be an equal in public space. And when you can't use a basic facility like a restroom, that inhibits your ability to have access equally in public space. And that's largely what they want to do, is isolate people from having that ability, especially in the trans community. They want to isolate the ability of trans people to have access in public space. And to say that this repeal of HB 2, which really isn't a repeal at all, because it keeps the rules in place for 3 years about anti-discrimination statutes from happening in any city, and it allows the state to keep the power about bathroom policy. To say that that's worthy enough of being allowed to go forward with the All-Star Game is really short-sighted, and to say that you're going to proceed with open access and anti-discrimination policies with the privately run facility is really short-sighted. And then to try to dress this up with, sports have a long history of helping to change attitudes about important social issues, and we believe holding our All-Star activities in Charlotte will be a powerful way for the NBA to continue, close quote. Well, here's the thing. You're absolutely right on the first half. You're absolutely wrong on the second half. That part of the way that sports has changed attitudes around important social issues has been punishing cities and states for their behavior. That the NFL moved the Super Bowl from Arizona when it refused to recognize Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday as a national holiday. When the NBA itself moved the game out of Charlotte and cost them millions of dollars in Charlotte, that was part of the pushback to change attitudes about important social issues, to push the envelope and put pressure on about important social issues. Having a faux repeal that doesn't really help anybody in the community and saying that's good enough to allow them to go back and make money is really frightening. It's really problematic. And that's why organizations like the Human Rights Campaign and Equality North Carolina have responded to this with a statement saying that HB 142, quote, continues the same anti-LGBTQ scheme put forward by the original measure, close quote. They also noted that, quote, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver stated that sites, hotels, and businesses involved with the NBA All-Star Game must put in place non-discrimination policies inclusive of the LGBTQ community. However, no such protections have been publicly proposed by the city or the state of North Carolina at this point. Quote, we need to see concrete guidelines and policies put in place that will live up to the proposed principles put forward by the NBA to protect all of its players and fans, said Equality Justice Interim Executive Director Matt Hershey. As we move forward with the All-Star Game to Charlotte, LGBTQ people must be invited to the discussions between the NBA, the City of Charlotte, and leadership to provide input and feedback on how to best protect LGBTQ people. We also saw Human Rights Campaign's Vice President for Policy and Political Affairs, Jody Winterhoff, saying, quote, North Carolina's discriminatory law prohibits the city of Charlotte from implementing non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ residents and visitors attending the All-Star Game. Nothing has changed that fact. It's critically important that people understand the gravity of this situation, which has the effect of extending discrimination and endangering LGBTQ people across the state of North Carolina. The NBA has been an outspoken opponent of HB2. However, HB 142 is not an HB2 repeal and replaces one discriminatory anti-transgender bathroom bill with another. It bans local LGBTQ non-discrimination protections statewide throughout 2020, and it substitutes the previous anti-transgender bathroom provisions with a new provision that forbids state agencies, public universities, primary and secondary schools, and cities from adopting policies ensuring trans people have access to restrooms consistent with their gender identity, close quote. So LGBTQ groups aren't supportive of this bill, don't think it goes far enough, don't think it's an actual repeal. The NBA itself says it doesn't go far enough as an actual repeal, yet it's good enough to let them host. It's really, really sad. It's really, really disappointing that the NBA is going to move on that and make that decision, and to put the All-Star Game in North Carolina and reward them for their reprehensible, no good, terrible, very bad conduct. Meanwhile, we are going to be talking about issues of domestic violence and sexual violence in this upcoming story, as the NBA's announced policy that it collectively bargained with the players and approved in December will start being enforced this summer on July 1st. A policy committee made up of 2 people from the NBA, 2 people from the Players Union, and 3 independent experts in domestic violence, sexual assault, or child abuse. The players can reach out to the committee on their own or be sent to it after a criminal conviction or after a, quote, disciplinary determination by the NBA's commissioner. The committee will pick an expert who will evaluate the players who have been referred. Then they're going to create a treatment and accountability plan for the player, which could include counseling, psychological evaluations, or any other testing. A player who doesn't follow their treatment plan will be punished with warnings, then fines, even to game suspensions. A confidential hotline will be set up for reporting domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. And that's really going to be another issue of, is that going to chill reporting? Is that going to be problematic there with the access to these issues of who's going to report and how it's going to be investigated? The NBA also said it's going to only get involved after a conviction, which is understandable, but it's also part of the issue that the court system doesn't always get things right. Policing has a number of problems that we've talked about on this broadcast before, a number of issues related to policing problems in investigations, especially in high-stakes cases like ones involving NBA players. That this is going to be the very real problem here, that it's only going to get involved with convictions. That in this case, that's what that's a problem. The league had suspended Jeffrey Taylor for 24 games for violating the, quote, standards of morality and prejudicial and detrimental conduct to the NBA. They're now going to be allowed to go before their commissioner and start asking for leniency. And the case-by-case factors, the mitigating factors, the mitigating issues that might happen are all going to be up to the commissioner as to whether or not they are going to have that. The commissioner can also put a player on administrative leave during the investigation. Players who don't cooperate with an investigation can be punished, but there's a huge exception in which, quote, circumstances where the player has a reasonable apprehension of criminal prosecution. The commissioner, of course, still has unilateral power to punish any player who violates the policy, punish anybody who's found guilty at trial, pleads guilty, or pleads no contest, because those are the defined violations of the policy. They can't punish anyone who's been acquitted at trial. And that's problematic, as we've talked about on this show, that the policing structures, especially in high-stakes cases like those involving NBA players or high-stakes athletes, tend to have problematic issues with getting it to a conviction in these cases. That it's already hard enough to get convictions in these cases, to have people report these underreported crimes, that only allowing for conviction is a good start in this case, but only allowing for the convictions to be the punishment structure is problematic on its face, and it's going to be a way that the NBA is really going to have to continue to try to delve in and deal with this situation. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical at the world sports, left sports media. We've just been discussing the current state of affairs with North Carolina getting rewarded for making a terrible law slightly less terrible, and the NBA's new policy on domestic violence and sexual violence. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical world of sports, left sports media, we'll be analyzing the latest out of Baylor, as well as some international soccer news, and an opportunity that the NHL really dropped to be an effective leader in pushing back against homophobia and homophobic language. Well, let's jump into unpaid college sports news. The Baylor tire fire continues. That it seems every week there is a brand new story to talk about with Baylor. That the cover-up of the investigations, the policing problems, the text messages that have been released making coaching staff and top officials and front office officials at the school and in the athletic department looking terrible, no good, horrible, and very bad in investigating a lot of these issues that have become part of the national scandal of Baylor University. And trigger warning, we are going to be talking about issues of sexual violence here in this case. Well, they are now facing seven different Title IX lawsuits from alleged survivors of sexual violence by Baylor players. The lawyers for 10 women are suing the school, and they're asking for the records from the independent investigation done by the law firm of Pepper Hamilton. That they want all the records from the Pepper Hamilton Law Review to get turned over publicly to these lawyers. Now, Baylor and Pepper Hamilton have tried to refuse to turn these over. And as we've talked about on this show for a number of weeks, there was a very real concerted effort to limit the paper trail involved with the Pepper Hamilton case. That there was no real official report that was written by Pepper Hamilton. There was only the very small list of suggestions of what the school could do that conveniently left out names, left out really substantive details, and other things that could be used in a court of law to push forward a case by a survivor, either against the perpetrators or against the school for the allegations. Baylor and Pepper Hamilton are trying to refuse to turn over these documents now, that any documents that they do have, saying it's attorney-client privilege. That they did their best to limit a paper trail, even when they got the official recommendations from Pepper Hamilton. Baylor representatives were told not to write anything down. Baylor representatives were told not to write anything down because they feared a paper trail and that these documents could necessarily get used in legal proceedings coming up against the school or against the players or against individual officials within the Baylor hierarchy, the Baylor structure of the athletic department and the university itself. Then they've tried to dress themselves up as it's attorney-client privilege. As the lawyers for the women said, quote, Baylor chose to structure its relationship with Pepper Hamilton as one of an independent investigator, and it only attempted to revise the relationship at the time Pepper Hamilton's findings and conclusions to become public came near, close quote. In late March, Baylor's interim president said that Pepper Hamilton indeed was only hired as an investigator and not a lawyer, that they were only hired as investigators. They were never hired as lawyers. But now that the information is coming public, now that there's a bevy of lawsuits against the school, they want to say that Pepper Hamilton and their lawyers were actually providing legal advice to the school, and therefore any documents that may be had, despite their best efforts to try to limit a paper trail, don't have to get turned over. It's really laughable on its face, and this would be a lot funnier if it wasn't so damn serious. That this is ridiculous, and nothing says like you're taking responsibility than ensuring the institution doesn't have to face any kind of real accountability, whether it's civil or criminal accountability. That you're trying to prevent any real details from coming out of what did the university know and when did they know it. What real things happened there, and we have these specifics that can get proven in a court of law. None of those documents are going to get turned over because Baylor is trying to present itself in a different way at this point, largely to cover its own behind. And that's frightening enough. But then ESPN did a story interviewing the new head coach, and it really read like it was the start of the redemption tour, that things have changed because they've gotten rid of some of the major leadership of the school. Things have changed because they got rid of the head football coach. And certainly this isn't necessarily to put down every effort that's being made by Coach Rule at Baylor, but the timing of this piece, given the other story about how Baylor's current leadership, the people who are currently employed, the people who currently have a job, the people who are currently involved there, how those people are trying to keep survivors from getting their day in court and turning over documents, that's problematic. And to simply say that everything was solved because you got rid of the few proverbial bad apples, that you got rid of the few proverbial bad people at the school, is belied by the fact that they're trying to prevent a lawsuit from happening here by turning over documents. And it really felt like this was the start of the redemption tour that we commonly see with these sorts of issues. We commonly see these sorts of issues and the redemption tours that come along with them. The redemption tour ideology of, let's put back the people who, we've spent some time, they now supposedly are really sorry about it, they're trying to change their ways, and let's move on the redemption tour. We're coming a year off of Baylor having been involved in this scandal, and Coach Rule can make all the positive changes he'd like. And it's not to put down all the positive changes that he's trying to make and trying to institute at Baylor, but when the leadership hierarchy of the structures of that school are still engaged in these kinds of behaviors, legally speaking, then we need to continue to harangue them and not let them get away with any kind of real redemption tour. Well, coming up in our final segment of the show, we are going to get into our look at some other sports news. In other sports news to close out this week's broadcast, the NHL really missed a big opportunity when Anaheim Ducks player Ryan Getzlaf, the captain of the Anaheim Ducks in a playoff game, used homophobic language. And the fine was an absolute slap on the wrist. It was a very minimal fine given how much money he actually makes in the NHL in his contract for the current season, that this was a fine that was very minimal. This was a fine that really wasn't going to do a whole lot to teach anybody a lesson about much of anything. And it reminded me as a Hawks fan of the Shaw incident, where he was suspended in the playoffs for his use of a homophobic slur. And it really reminded me of that. When he got suspended during the playoff game, he got fined $5,000. He was required to undergo sensitivity training, and Andrew Shaw had to do all of that. And in the immediate aftermath of the game, Andrew Shaw was tearful. He was really sad and really remorseful about what he said, and realized that even though he was remorseful, even though he was, understanding that, what he did was really totally and completely inappropriate, it wasn't going to simply get past any kind of consequences. He was still suspended for a game in the playoffs. And yet we didn't get that with Ryan Getzlaf here. The NHL had a big opportunity to send Getzlaf to sensitivity training, to really highlight these issues, because Shaw, after the game, recognized what he did was terrible, what he did was totally wrong and inappropriate, that arguably he was in less need of sensitivity training than Getzlaf is on these issues. That Shaw recognized what he did was really terrible and reprehensible and wrong, and he needed a consequence for it. Getzlaf gave a really bad apology as well, saying, quote, "I've got to be a little more responsible with the words I choose. As a father, as somebody who takes a lot of pride in this game, it's tough to see somebody refer to it as what the Canadian broadcaster TSN did, which was a homophobic slur. I didn't mean it in that manner in any way, and for that to go down that route was very disappointing for me. I accepted responsibility and I accepted it fine. We talked to the league and I understand it's my responsibility to not use vulgar language, period, whether it's a swear word or what it is. I hope I didn't offend anybody outside of the circle that we trust," close quote. Yes, you do need to be, quote, "a little more responsible with the words that you choose." But to blame it on the media for calling it a homophobic slur is completely wrong and problematic. Gay men were calling it a slur when it happened. The community that was affected was calling it a homophobic slur. Not the media. The people who are in the group that you were trying to demean said it was a slur. And when they say it's a slur, you don't get to go say that it's not. When the affected community says it hurts, you don't get to go and say it doesn't. And yes, you must understand your responsibility to not use vulgar language, and you accepted responsibility. And the NHL failed to suspend for one game and continue the precedent that they set with Andrew Shaw. They failed to set that precedent. They failed to set that precedent. And we also saw a alt-right group of Proud Boys try to get funding because they felt that Getzlaf was only being fined because of the offender-triggered snowflakes, liberal cooks, ha ha ha. You know, that same old right-wing trope that we constantly get. And so an alt-right group has tried to get the funding to pay for Getzlaf's fine. And what's really damning about the NHL's situation here is not only did the NHL not suspend, not only did the NHL only give a slap on the wrist fine, but the LGBTQ ambassador for the team, Ryan Kessler, has not said a mumbling word about any of this. That the LGBTQ team ambassador, Ryan Kessler, has not said a thing. That's problematic. That's dangerous. That's wrong. Ryan Kessler should be out very vocally saying this kind of thing is not appropriate in our locker room. And as an ally, it's really not appropriate because you don't necessarily know which players on other teams or which referees or which fans or which members of your own team in your own locker room might be gay. And the fact that we have heard crickets, nothing, nada, zilch, zero, mumbling, nothing from Kessler is really problematic. The NHL has failed here on a number of different levels, and it really needs to come out and do something about this really big issue that they've built for themselves in this totally wrong reaction to Ryan Getzlaf and his comments that he made on the ice. Meanwhile, in international soccer news, the 2018 FIFA World Cup. Yes, the FIFA World Cup that is set to be held in Russia that we talked about last month on the show, where it was having a number of issues of human rights abuses and labor rights abuses, especially with the use of North Korean quasi-slave labor to build some of these stadium facilities, is back in the news as the head of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, admitted this week that human rights abuses did indeed happen in St. Petersburg as Russia gears up to host the 2018 World Cup. Yes, he admitted that human rights abuses occurred. He described that the conditions for the North Korean laborers were, quote, often appalling, close quote. Now, it makes me wonder, would Gianni Infantino have said anything just given that there was investigative reports, or the only reason he said anything because the heads of the Icelandic, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish football associations all wrote to him about the conditions of the workers and described them as, quote, slave-like and, quote, exploitation. It makes me wonder, would Gianni Infantino, as the head of FIFA, really said anything at all about this? Would he have said anything if the heads of these FAs didn't leverage pressure against him? Infantino said that they found out about this in November and saw that in an inspection that this stuff had happened, but that in a March inspection, there were no more North Korean laborers. Infantino said, quote, as a consequence of the relatively high number of incompliances compared with other FIFA World Cup stadiums found in St. Petersburg, and due to the fatal accidents that happened on that construction site, FIFA and the local organizing committee have required the general contractor to take immediate steps to rectify the issues identified, close quote. That includes the accidents that killed 5 workers, their treatment on the worksite, and not paying workers their proper salary. So when you admit that human rights abuses have happened in a country, when does a country become ineligible to host a World Cup? When you've acknowledged that human rights abuses have happened and they've continued to happen after multiple inspections, at what point do you pull the World Cup? At what point do you hold them accountable? At what point do we see accountability structures happening here? At what point does that happen? Or do we just, say that, well, we're going to have them rectify it and then continue to kick the ball down the field and, oh, well, now that they've continued to not really rectify these issues, but, oh, it's so close to us hosting the World Cup, so we got to let them host because there's no time to fix it. When there's plenty of time to fix it now, there's plenty of time that we can deal with this now, and FIFA is really refusing to do anything, and they're just kicking the ball down the field and hoping that in the future we're all just going to kind of ignore it, and that if it comes up again, oh, well, we're now really close to 2018, and so Russia's going to kind of have to be the de facto host. But hey, we care about human rights, even though we put off the vote on the Palestinian issue until at least 2018 as well, rather than address those human rights issues happening in Palestine. And to close out the news with some happy stuff, that certainly on the ground actual work is something that is very, very important, but we're also big fans of the symbolic demonstration, the symbolic protest, like we talked about at the top of the show involving Colin Kaepernick, that on the ground actual work is important, but there's also an important place for symbolism happening. And the men's and women's U.S. national team has announced that they will be wearing rainbow numbers on their jerseys to celebrate Pride Month in their June 3rd, June 8th, and June 11th games. After wearing these jerseys, they will put them up for auction with money going to charities. So a very cool symbolic move by the U.S. national teams for soccer, both the men's and the women's team, getting involved in the Pride movement there. This has been Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, Left Sports Media, a weekly news hour highlighting the various intersections overlapping the world of sports, activism, and radical politics. We are available for broadcast by Pacifica Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are. If you can't listen live or you happen to miss any part of today's show, we are also available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of our podcast and video editions are available at notanothersportshow.podbean.com and tinyurl.com/NASRadio video. And big thanks to our friends at Urbana Public Television for the assistance with our video broadcast. To contact the show, you can use @NASRadioSports on Twitter and Instagram, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, and use the NAS Radio hashtag to get in contact with us about your thoughts on the various subjects that we have brought up on the show. For all of us here at the broadcast, this has been another edition of Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, leftist sports media, and we will be back with you next week to talk about the world of sports, politics, social activism, the intersections in between these issues, because we can no longer cede these spaces solely to the political right, solely to political reactionaries, that we can look at sports from a left perspective and not simply write off sports as an entire idea of meatheads smashing into each other. That sports is a way to discuss social issues, it's a way to have these important conversations, and we very much need to continue to develop a space where leftists can be sports fans, but also be social radicals and endorse very radical ideas and discuss these ideas in a space that we also allow for sports.